So, Ross, I would absolutely love to take you back to the beginning of your career. When did you first know that you wanted to become a journalist and specifically to write about economics?
Well, that's two different questions. I did a lot of amateur journalism long before I came to the Herald. I did amateur journalism in the salvos, and then the year before I came here, I did a year of what's now the journalism course at UTS, and during that year, I became the co-editor of the student newspaper. So that's the journalism that I'd done. My lecturer there convinced me that I could get it, if I wanted to, I could get a job as a journalist, and he would help me. And in fact, he got me an interview at the Herald. When did I want to be a journalist? From the moment he convinced me that I could be one if I tried. And after I'd been here just a few weeks, I realised that this was a job that required me to do the one thing that I could do, and that's when I decided I'm right now. But when it comes to writing about economics, that was soon after I arrived, I got called into the editor's office. He said to me, "What are your ambitions in journalism?" I said, "I want to write about politics." He said, "Well, everyone wants to write about politics. We don't have any trouble finding reporters who want to do politics. What we really need is someone who can do economics. You're an accountant, economics, pretty much the same thing, isn't it?" I thought, "You must be an idiot." But fortunately, I didn't say that. And I thought, this is good advice. It's the best advice I had. And he said, I thought, right, I did do a lot of economics at uni. I've forgotten most of it, but I did. So if you tell me that that's the go, that's what I want to be.
Okay, and I think a lot of readers and a lot of listeners would agree that part of the reason you have become to be so revered is that you are able to explain economics in a really plain speaking way. But you did just admit in a feature published today that economics has the potential to be boring. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think it's important for everyday people to have an understanding of economics? What really is economics?
Well, you just said it. You said everyday people. There's one famous economist defined economics as the study of ordinary people in the ordinary business of life. That means people who get up, go to work, earn the money, and then go to the supermarket and spend it. That is what economics studies. In other words, we study what happens in people's ordinary lives, and we like to think we understand how it works a bit better than the ordinary people do, and that's the reason. Another thing is that economists are obsessed by tax. Guess what? So are most people. We're always on about inflation. We're always on about unemployment. Do you think those are topics that interest people? Yes, they are. It's called the cost of living crisis.
Yeah.
So that's why economics is interesting. And I have just got to make sure that I keep getting to that bit, not all the highfalutin stuff about the financial markets and all that, which you don't actually need to know anything about.
Yeah.
What you do need to know is why the politicians are doing what they're doing, and whether what they're doing is okay or it should be something else.
So is it correct what I'm hearing from you say really is that the business of economics is really about the practical realities that sort of determine the quality of our life?
Yes, and I have tried to emphasise that in the part of economics that I write about. I write about the bit that I think will be interesting and important to our readers. I could write about all the interesting things that are happening in the Indonesian economy, but I don't think people will be all that interested, so I don't.
Okay, so I really wanted to ask you about the impact of the various economic policies that you've witnessed over the last 50 years. So, which economic policy do you think has been the most woeful, the most damaging to the Australian people? And which economic policy do you actually think has been the most beneficial in that time?
Well, I know you're going to think this is hard to believe. It probably just proves that my memory is going. But I can't remember a policy worse than the original version of the stage 3 tax cuts. They were grossly unfair. They were going to reduce bracket creep, but do it in an unfair way. They were all about big tax cuts for people at the top, not much or even none for people towards the bottom. And that isn't the right thing for now. The other thing about the stage 3 tax cuts, they were planned and worked out and decided 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And they were put into legislation 5 years ago. The great crime for any government is to say, I know that in 5 years' time or 6 years' time, a big tax cut shaped like this is exactly what we'll need. You cannot know that. And in fact, it turns out that it wasn't anything like what we needed.
I find this really interesting because, as someone who has not specialized in economics, I was surprised. This was legislated in 2018, I believe it was. And I remember thinking, how can a government promise they're going to institute this when they don't know what the economy is going to be like this many years later? So my question to you is, has this happened before, this sort of lag and this promise in the last 50 years, or is this sort of unprecedented?
Well, one Labor treasurer stood up on budget night and said, I've fixed it, the budget is back to surplus and it's going to stay in surplus. And he had figures in front of him done by Treasury that said that. Didn't happen.
So who was this?
This was Wayne Swan. And it's the great regret of his life that people keep throwing it up at him. You can't make economic forecasts are more likely to be wrong than to be right, and that actually tells you that economists don't know it. They know more about the economy than you do, but they don't know nearly as much as they think they know.
Yeah.
And they want you to think. And the test of whether they really understand the economy is whether they can forecast what will happen, and they can't.
Okay.
And one of the great things I've learnt in my career is that the future is unknowable. But everybody you meet wants you to tell them what's going to happen. And it's a great temptation of economists is to pretend that they know what's going to happen.
Which brings me to you, Ross Gittins, because you have not been shy about copying to the fact that you have also got some predictions wrong over the years. So I wanted to ask you, what's the number one prediction that you got wrong?
I think it was the recession of the early 90s. Treasury was saying, well, there hasn't been a wage explosion, and it's going to be a soft landing. And that was exactly wrong. And by then, a lot of people who are out there in the real world could tell that it wasn't going to be a soft landing. So I got that badly wrong. It was actually the worst recession we'd had since the Great Depression.
Okay, so really wrong. So I'm just wondering, what did you learn about yourself, if anything, to get something so wrong so publicly?
Well,
did it teach you anything?
Yes, it taught me a lot, and that is the ups and downs of the economy can have lots of different reasons. Treasury said we haven't had a wage explosion, so it won't be a bad recession. Well, that's kind of true, but it didn't actually work. Something else had gone wrong. People had borrowed very heavily. Businesses had borrowed very heavily, and so when the economy went down and people weren't spending, businesses had to spend a lot of time cutting their costs, laying off workers to make up for the fact that they had paid $2 million to buy an office block that was now worth $1 million.
Now, I wanted to sort of take the lens back, I guess, a bit and ask you a broader question, which is, what are the most seismic economic changes that you've witnessed in the last 50 years that people might not realize even shape the way we live now?
Well, this is one that everyone knows, but they kind of got used to. But I can remember when it wasn't, and that is the increased participation of women in the paid workforce. That has been the greatest single change. It's still going on. What's happening is that we're gradually taking a labour force that was built for men and knocking it into shape so that it can give women, particularly people with families and so on, a decent go. Now, we've still got a long way to go. One of the big things that has improved but also has more to go is childcare assistance. But the thing that I think is that the reason for the emancipation of women is that sometime in the 1960s, the parents of Australia and the parents of all the rich countries, they decided that their daughters were just as much entitled to a decent education as their sons. That was the big social change, and everything flows from that. Women stay long in universities. These days they do better at university than boys. They stay longer at school, and then they're more likely to go on to university. They do better because they do their homework. And gradually they're getting more of the good jobs. That's happened at the Herald. The previous editor, Lisa Davies, I haven't said this, but I meant to, and I should have. Lisa Davies will be remembered for running a campaign to get more women into the top jobs at the Herald, starting with her.
It's interesting what you're saying. I think I probably speak for many female listeners in particular out there who would say, as I would, that there's still a long way to go. There is still pay discrepancy between men and women in the workforce. So what policies do you think, if any, should be brought in, or reforms that would bring things to where a lot of us think they should be?
One of the things that would help is for childcare to be totally free, for the government to pay for it all. I think that would be, because one of the things that's wrong with income tax is the people, all the men, all the old well-paid men say, oh, those high tax rates at the top, oh, they discourage people from working. It's not true. Those people have good jobs, they're well paid, they get to push people around and be respected. They don't need to, and they've got an accountant who knows how to get around it all.
Right.
I'm not worried about them. It's actually the higher rates at the bottom which affect the people who really do have a job. See, if you're a man and you've got a full-time job, you don't have much, most men don't have much choice and don't think they have much choice, but to work full-time and to work whatever hours the boss says he wants worked. The people who do have have the flexibility to say it's not worth it or I will do it, particularly people with young children, mainly women, some men, but mainly women, who decide that they'll work 2 days a week or 3 days a week, and that can be a decision that's heavily influenced by how much the government taxes you and by how much it takes away your childcare benefits. And when these old men bang on about how taxes discourage people, they don't discourage the old men, they discourage the young women, and that's where we ought to be doing things. And to a modest extent, the changes to the stage 3 tax cuts are intended to to make it a little less bad for women making those decisions down towards the bottom of the scale.
Okay, so you're saying the government should be implementing free childcare.
Yes.
So just so I understand
That's the easiest way
Yeah.
to just take away one of the big costs.
Yeah.
See, there are costs. When I decide not to stay at home with the kids but to go out and work, there are costs weighed against not just the wage you're going to be paid,
Yeah.
but what's left after that it's been taxed, and what's left after they've taken account of your partner's wage and cut back your childcare benefit.
And so
your family benefit.
And so would this essentially mean a new tax to fund this free childcare? Is that what you're saying? Everyone should be taxed to fund for this free childcare?
Yes, I am saying that. And in theory, yes, we ought to have a new tax that says this is the tax that's going to pay for free childcare, which just about every family will benefit from when they're going through that stage of their life. Politicians would find that very, very hard, and so what they do is sneak the income tax up without asking for permission, without having an argument about it at an election campaign, and the way they sneak it up is called bracket creep. So I actually believe that bracket creep's not such a bad thing, and I also think that if you look at the mentality of the Australian voter, after a while you get the feeling that the message they're sending to the politicians is, if you must put taxes up, okay, but please don't tell me about it.
Right.
And that's what they do.
And so what does it say about our culture more broadly that we don't have free childcare? You know, have the voters actually been pushing?
It just says we're transitioning from a patriarch. That's what it says.
Yeah.
Patriarchy.
And what are the chances that any government would actually bring that in?
Oh, I think they're quite good. Because
Why?
it's already heavily subsidised. You just do the last bit and simplify the whole thing. Now it's actually quite complicated because you're deciding who gets it and who doesn't, and you're trying to make sure that people who don't really need it don't get it. This is really one of the big choices in public policy, and that is universal versus means tested. Do you give it to everyone, which means all the rich people get it?
Yeah.
Or do you means test it, which says only if we consider you really need it, you're going to get it. Now, most of our system is means tested. All our pensions and benefits are means tested. That's one of the reasons why, though no Australian knows it, we pay less tax than most other countries, and that is because we have a totally means tested welfare state.
And has that historically been the case?
Yes.
And what does that reflect about us and our values?
Well, it's not a bad system. I think it's worked well, and it's particularly an Australian and also a kind of a Kiwi view on life that the Americans don't have and the Europeans don't have. The Brits don't even have it. But that's what we've said. We'll keep taxes tight by not giving benefits to people who don't really need it.
Okay. Now, I wanted to ask you the next question because a lot of people, they hear the word tax, they hear the words economic reform, and they, you know what I mean, it puts them to sleep. But actually, it's actually quite a feisty, passionate sort of area. People get very upset. And to that point, you called your 2015 memoir, Gittins, A Life Among Budgets, Bulldust, and Bastardry. So I wanted to drill down a little bit into the bastardry that you've witnessed over the last 50 years. What have been the worst that you've seen?
You could say they're bastards because they make promises that they really know they won't be keeping. They often do that.
So give us some examples. What are the worst?
Yeah, the worst example was when Tony Abbott was going to romp home in the 2013 election.
Yeah.
He thought there's a tiny chance I might not get this.
Yeah.
So about 2 weeks before the election, he ran around saying, I won't be cutting education, health or the ABC. And as soon as he got to power, that's the first thing he did. And it's been explained. In fact, Kathy Wilcox had a lovely cartoon.
Yeah.
Where Tony Abbott famously said, sometimes I think it's better to ask for forgiveness after than ask for permission before.
Now, I believe when that happened, for one thing, my understanding is Tony Abbott actually didn't even warn his cabinet that this is what was going to be happening, and that actually his politicians were crying because they were saying, how are we going to explain this to our electorates, that this is what's happening?
But when you get close to an election, my experience of politicians is they've only got one thing in mind, and that is winning that election. And if you happen to stumble in their path to the election, they will kick you out of the way as they go. And they do things in election campaigns that wouldn't dream of doing, except when they sort of got the bloodlust.
Now, we spoke briefly before we started recording today, and you said one of the worst things you'd seen was politicians putting the boot into people that they know that voters don't like. So can you tell me about this in terms of this being some of the bastardry that you've seen?
It's people on the dole, people who don't have jobs. Our politicians know that a large number of ordinary people, this is a phenomenon that seems to be particularly Australian, of downward envy. You're supposed to envy the people at the top who've got more money and freedom than you've got. But we also envy the people below us, especially those lazy bastards who are sitting at home watching daytime television while I'm going out spreading blood and tears, earning my way and paying taxes, and they're just sitting around. They could go out and get a job. They're dole bludgers. Now, that is not true, but a lot of people think that, and both sides of politics cater to that prejudice. And that's the reason why even the Labor Party, who's supposed to be splashing money around everywhere, are very, very reluctant to increase unemployment benefits, because they know that a lot of people who vote Labor will say, why are you giving money to those lazy bastards?
Now, this doesn't seem to be the attitude, and I imagine it might be reflected in economic reforms in some of the Scandinavian countries. So what does it say about us that there's this envy towards people who are disadvantaged, and we look at them as though they're bludgers and they're sort of doing us they're doing us dirty? What does it say about us?
That we're not the lovely people we like to think Australians are.
And where does that come from, do you think?
It comes from being human. It comes from being less than perfect.
Aren't we just?
But it also comes because the politicians, in the old days, if everyone was on the wrong tram, politicians would stand up and preach sermons about how, now that's not right, and it's not right because of this, and you should think that. And these days, the politicians are inclined to say, those silly buggers think this, which is wrong. They shouldn't think that. But if that is what they think, and I know very well what they think because we have all these surveys, we have all these focus groups, it's all about saying, what are the punters really thinking? And so I am not going to run up head to head and say, you are a silly bugger, you're wrong about this, and you really ought to think that. I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to pander to your weaknesses. That's the best way for me to get myself re-elected.
Okay, now in the course of 50 years, you've written about the most powerful people in the country. And so I'm wondering what sort of backlash you've received from these people you've often written about. So can you tell me about the most memorable call you've received from a treasurer?
Well, all calls I've received from treasurers are memorable because I get so few of them.
Okay.
I had one who rang me up to tell me what they were going to announce tomorrow. He did that.
Who was this?
I don't think I'm going to say that.
Really, Ross?
Well, he was giving me a heads up, and he
Okay.
did that because he knew that I would use the information, but I wouldn't rush out and put it in the paper a day early.
Okay.
And he also wanted to make sure that I would write a comment that said, yes, great idea. He was pretty sure I would.
And is that what you did?
Yes, I did agree with it, and not because I was mates with him, but because it was stuff I agreed with.
So why did he give it to you ahead of time?
Just so that I could think about it before I wrote.
I wanted to ask you about the impact that your writing has had on your readers, because you have said that your goal has never been to impress the editor or your peers, but actually it is to serve the reader, which I think reflects on what you've just been saying. So what's the most poignant or affecting feedback you've ever had from a reader about how one of your columns has perhaps changed their life or benefited their life?
Well, I don't think I've done much to change people's lives. I've had a lot of people say that I got them through the HSC, and I suppose that would change getting through the HSC rather than failing it probably has some effect on your life. But when it comes, and the truth is that I have people saying nice things about me. I've had that for 40 years. I've had people stop me in the street and say, "You're Ross Gittins, I like your column." And I get a lot more praise and encouragement than the editor would get. I would get 10 times more than he gets. But when you say what it has affected me, I have to tell you that the reader whose remarks affected me were one of my nieces, Sonia, who was doing the HSC, studying economics. The teacher tells her to say, "You got to read Ross Gittins' columns." She said to me, "Every time I read your columns, I can hear you saying it." And that's the best praise I've ever had, because that is what I was trying to do. Write in a way that's like a conversation, not like a formal statement.
Yeah. Ross, I wanted to turn now to broadly the changes I guess you've seen over the years. And I'm just wondering, on what issue has your opinion changed the most and why?
That's a good one. Well, my opinions keep changing, they keep evolving. They've changed the most and gone different directions. I think probably on how wages should be fixed. When I came to be an economic journalist, we had for many years a centralised wage fixing system where basically everybody got the same percentage increase on the same day. It was called a national wage, and it got increased by, everyone got the same percentage increase. And I sort of thought that was okay, but Paul Keating initiated a move away from that with his mate, the head of the unions, Bill Kelty, and they moved to this system of trying to set wages at the enterprise level. So every business would decide with its workers how much they were going to increase pay and change the arrangements. I thought that was really flexible and a great idea, but it's turned out to be something that's given employers far too much freedom to chisel their workers. So I really changed my views on that. First I thought it was bad, then I thought it was good, and now I think that it was better but not as good. And I really think it's probably the most sensible system is to have this thing that this government has just been trying to introduce last year, which is, it's basically wages being set by industry. And if you do that, it turns out the employers are a lot easier. If you're going to put my wages up by the same amount that my competitors' wages are going up, I'm more relaxed about that. But if I have to put my wages up and I don't know what he's going to do, that makes me twitchy.
Now, you just mentioned Paul Keating there, of course, and you have written that you think he has been the best treasurer that you've seen. So I wonder,
that is a statement of the obvious.
Tell me though, why was he the best?
Because he really wanted to change things and fix things in a way that just about all the politicians on both sides since then, with the possible exception of John Howard and Peter Costello, haven't wanted to do. The modern politicians don't really want to fix anything much. They say they do, and they tell themselves they do, but they don't want to do anything that's going to run them a big risk of getting tossed out.
And so what were the reforms that Paul Keating put through that you know?
Well, just about all the big changes came in that time. The floating of the dollar, the removal of all the import duty protection on manufacturing, the deregulation of the banks. The banking has changed beyond recognition. And lots of other industries have been deregulated. And the other thing they've done, which I don't like much, and I think hasn't worked, is saying, well, look, the government ought to be paying for this service, but it'd really be much more efficient if we just got private sector people to actually deliver. We just pay the private sector to do it for us. That has been, for the most part, an utter disaster. And we are slowly pulling back from it.
And are you thinking there the privatization of railways and things like that? Or
no, I'm thinking not so much. I'm thinking of having for-profit firms paid by the government to provide childcare. That's been tricky. And in fact, very early in that arrangement, one outfit bought up all the stuff and then went bust, and that caused some huge problems. But the private providers of aged care some aged care used to be provided by the government. A lot was provided by churches and other charities. And then we said, no, let's just get some kind of entrepreneurial guy who's in there to make a buck. But because the private sector is always more efficient than the public sector, it'll be great. And it hasn't been, because they might have found ways to do things more cheaply, but that's because they've been worried about their profits. So it hasn't left the users better off. It hasn't stopped a decline in the quality of those services, and it has confused even childcare more than it should. And there are many other examples that you could give of where, which is, and a good one is, the provision of employment services. That means helping people who don't have a job to find a job. And that's been, we used to have a big outfit called the Commonwealth Employment Service that did that, set up by Ben Chifley or someone. Didn't work wonderfully, but it worked okay. We got rid of all that. And again, we sort of said, well, we'll get the charities to do it, but there's not enough of them, so we'll let people who are just there to make a buck do it. And that's been disastrous. It's been badly run by the bureaucrats. You see, whenever you do this, a lot of the people from the private sector are saying, this is the government. We know they got pots of money. If I grab a bit more of it, no one's going to notice. and they grab a bit more of it. And what happens is that the quality of the service being provided to the voters goes down, and you get a whole cycle of scandals in aged care homes. We've been getting it from pretty much since we set up this system. We still haven't fixed it. The latest story is that you can have a badly run home and still get rated by some government agency as 5-star.
And so,
in other words, the government is running a system that misleads people, misleads me and you about how our mother is likely to be treated if we put her in this home, not that. It's terrible stuff.
And so, broadly speaking, do you think economically we've moved from doing better at taking care of people who are vulnerable to just doing a far worse job at that?
Well, we never did it well, but we're doing it worse. And it was because of this idea that made a lot of sense to a lot of people, and that is private sector is always more efficient than the public sector. People who were pushing this were people who'd worked in the public sector all their life, and they knew that the public sector was capable of doing crazy things. True. I've worked for the private sector all my life, and guess what? I know that profit-motivated private businesses can still do stupid things. The thing is, what makes it hard for the government is the government has multiple objectives. We've got to do the right thing by women. We've got to run this thing right well. We've got to observe privacy. We've got to do that. We've got to do all things that if you're the government, you've got to do. And the private sector has one objective, and that is to make a buck. That's very simple, and they are very effective at making a buck. Unfortunately, too much of the buck that they make comes by lowering the quality of the service that they're being paid to provide.
And so, what's been the most important economic reform, I guess, that you've witnessed in your entire career?
One of them, believe it or not, would be Medicare. And probably another one would be the introduction of compulsory superannuation. And both of those...
Paul Keating, I believe.
Yes, although not... Medicare really started under the Whitlam government. It was called... The first go they had was called Medibank. Fraser government comes along and dismantles it all. Labor gets back. They say, right, we're putting all that stuff back where we had it and you moved it. And this time we'll call it Medicare. And this time it worked and it stuck. And you knew it was stuck when one of the leading lights in the opposition, John Howard, made it clear that there were no votes in going to an election saying we're going to screw around with Medicare. And the Liberal Party doesn't do that. Because they know that Medicare is so popular. And by the way, it's also popular because of one of these illusions, and that is when everyone's bulk billing, I can kid myself that going to the doctor is free. It's not free. It's in the taxes I pay, and it's in the taxes other people pay. But I don't have to shell out on the day, so I like it.
Okay.
It's an illusion.
Right, and you did, of course, mention compulsory superannuation, which is, as I understand it, or was a Paul Keating introduction.
Well, yes, but you'd have to give his mate Bill Kelty a lot of credit.
Give him a bit of credit for that.
And by the way, if you're talking about angry phone calls, I wrote a piece that was very critical of the unions on superannuation. And
critical of what specifically?
I was saying that the union movement had got into bed with all the big bankers and financiers who were making money out of super. But I manage all this money for you, and I put it into these shares, and then I move it into those shares. And by the way, I just charge a small fee, and that fee ends up being amazingly high.
Yeah.
the fees that people pay on their superannuation can be higher than their electricity bill.
Wow.
But everyone knows about their electricity bill because once a quarter they send you a piece of paper that says, this is how much. What?
Yeah.
They don't bother looking through all the bits of paper that their super fund sends them, and they don't have an idea that they are being charged quite high amounts for me to manage their money for them.
So who called you?
And
In a very angry tone.
he wasn't angry, but I almost fell on the floor when I picked up the phone, and I heard this guy say, Ross, there's this Bill Kelty. I thought, oh no, one of my heroes is going to take me to task.
Yes, and?
Well, we had a discussion where we didn't quite agree, but it was very friendly.
No four-letter words.
But the point is, Keating had put him up to it. Keating knew Keating was convinced that I was against his great invention of superannuation, which wasn't quite true. And he knew that he could never persuade me, so he got his mate Bill to ring me up.
And so what did Bill say?
I was polite. He said, oh, Ross, that's just wrong. Ross, that's just wrong. Oh, Bill, is that right, Bill? Why, Bill? How, Bill?
And what did he say you'd got wrong?
Basically saying that one of his creations, joint creations with Keating, compulsory superannuation, which is all part of the accord with the unions, that it wasn't as good as it cracked up to be, and that the unions were in bed with all these bankers who were saying, I'll look after your money for just a little fee. When I pressed him, he did say, yes, well, I always thought they should have done that and not that. Oh, okay, Bill.
Ross, it's been an absolute pleasure hearing your perspective that's been built over 50 years, so thank you so much for joining us.
Well, my pleasure.